So, and is there a starker indicator of the economic disparity between the US and Canada than that? Or do you think that's the primary statistic?
I mean, I think housing costs are another one. There was a study out just 10 days ago that has Toronto and Vancouver now by far the most unaffordable housing markets in North America. And so, housing costs are 50% higher in Toronto than they are in Chicago, even though Chicago workers make 50% more money. The same is true between Vancouver and Seattle. Seattle workers make way more than Vancouver workers, but housing is 60 or 70% more expensive in Vancouver. So on all the measures,
we're making less by a lot.
Yes.
By a lot.
By a lot.
Yeah.
And we're paying more.
Paying more by a lot.
Yeah.
Right. And most of that's transpired in the last 10 years.
Yes. And we're paying the difference by accumulating enormous quantities of debt. Our households are by far the most indebted in the G7. When you divide total household debt by GDP, we now have a bigger stock of household debt than our entire economy. We are more indebted as households than the Americans were right before the 2008 financial crisis. And so what we have as a model in Canada is we have artificial scarcity imposed by a very heavy and restrictive state, confiscatory state. So that suppresses production. Mm-hmm. But in order to allow for consumption, we print money and borrow money and then flood the economy with that money.
Okay, so that's another problem. So that's the inflationary problem.
Yes.
Now, the problem with inflation, there's many problems with inflation, but one of them is that it particularly punishes people who are thrifty and who save.
Yes.
Right. So inflation punishes the people who forego gratification to invest in the future.
That's right.
Right. So that's a very bad idea.
It's a horrible. Inflation is the single most immoral tax for so many reasons. One, it takes from savers and people who are trying to be responsible, thus making it impossible to be responsible. Right. Because you will, if you refuse to play the inflation game of borrowing money to buy things you can't afford, someone else inevitably will, and you won't be able to afford anything. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So you ultimately have to act responsibly. It's like Milton Friedman was asked, what would you do with your money in times of inflation? He said, spend it.
Right.
Like the first thing you want to do when inflation is out of control is to make sure you get rid of this thing that's losing its value. The second reason it's immoral is it takes from the poor, because the poorest people they do not have the ability to buy inflation-proof assets like gold and real estate and fancy watches and art collections and fancy wines and things that go up with or even exceed inflation. So it's a very big wealth transfer from the poor and the working class to the very, very wealthy. A very small group of people actually get richer.
So the socialist policies that provide goods and services to Canadians, let's say, or denizens of other countries, by printing money, actually punish the poor brutally.
Oh, absolutely.
In consequence of the inflation that they generate.
Yes. I mean, all the socialist policies in practice redistribute from the working class to the super wealthy in practice. Mm-hmm. And I can prove that again and again and again.
In theory.
In practice.
Yeah.
In practice, all the redistribution that happens in these so-called socialist countries ultimately goes from the working class to the super wealthy. That is the reality. But just one last thing on inflation. Yep. The final reason why it's so immoral is nobody votes on it. The basic principle of our parliamentary system is the government can't tax what Parliament has not voted. The people no taxation without representation, right? But no one ever votes to have the money printing happen. And so the inflation is adopted secretly, and you blame the grocer because groceries are more expensive, or your local gas station because gas is more, or your realtor because when in fact it was actually the government that bid up all of those things with money printing, and you didn't even know about it. Mm-hmm. So it is silent. It's a silent thief that takes from the poor and gives to the richest people, and it destroys the working class. And that's why I want to crush inflation. We need a policy that seeks to stop inflation at all costs.
Okay, so what would you do to stop inflation?